This is Chapter 2, Lecture Part 2. Last lecture in Part 1, we left off talking about intrinsic value versus instrumental value. And now we're going to continue on with environmental ethics views. So we were talking in Part 1 about how we have different types of ethics for the way we live versus our environmental ethics. So now we're going to start talking about some of the environmental ethics. So there are what we call anthropocentric ethics. In anthropocentric ethics, intrinsic value is only applied to humans. Most individuals have this ethic. They live by this environmental ethic, which is humans are the only ones who have intrinsic value. Every other species is an instrument to us, meaning we use it for our benefit. Now, if you have a biocentric ethic, then that means that you think that every living organism has intrinsic value. If you have an ecocentric ethic, that means that you have intrinsic value is given to communities and ecosystems. And so, there's a lot of value that's placed on these communities of organisms and ecosystems. Ecocentric ethicists believe that a collection of organisms or critical features in the environment are what has intrinsic value. And the deep ecological movement falls under this. So these are the ideas that environmental ethics are out there. So do you have an anthropocentric view, a biocentric ethical view, or an ecocentric ethical view? So it's really, these are really tough lines to draw. Most of us have anthropocentric views. There's also something that we call ecofeminism, and this actually deals a little bit with environmental injustice. And one of the things is thought is that this is kind of a new ideal that that feminine concerns for interrelationships among humans, non-human life, and the environment is what we call ecofeminism. And many ecofeminists point out that women often suffer disproportionately from human destruction of the environment, meaning that when we destroy environments, women seem to be the ones who always foster the burden. For example, when we pollute wells, then women have to travel farther to collect water, which leaves them more vulnerable to rape or attack. So there's just lots of ideals that, or when we don't have access to 24/7 water, most of the time women are put in the fact of they're the ones who are going to have to go get the water wherever it is. And because of that, they're not going to be able to be educated. So there's a whole new ethical counterpart that says, listen, women are the ones who are disproportionately burdened by the fact that we have such environmental problems. Even in terms of consumption, most in third world countries, a lot of times women are the ones who work in the factories. They work in the sweatshops, children, all of that, and that's a big problem. So in environmental ethics, of course, we try and seek environmental justice, and this is another topic that we're going to discuss in this chapter. Previously in the overview, I talked about the fact that environmental injustice used to relate usually to race, but now environmental ethics refers to the fact that of lack of information, lack of education, lack of income, because poor people are more disproportionately burdened with environmental injustice. And so environmental justice seeks to protect natural resources for all, regardless of their race, gender, or economic status. And it's involved in many, of course, international treaties or negotiations on global issues. And this is a big concern for developmental regions, is the fact that are we going in there and raping and plundering all of their resources for just our human gain? So, a lot of children mine cobalt, a lot of children mine diamonds, and this is why. So the first world countries can get better, and the third world countries can then suffer disproportionately. So big problems. Okay, so that's the ethics portion of this chapter. Now we're going to move on to a little bit of the economics, supply and demand. So a lot of us, I hope, know what supply and demand is that the price of an item increases when the demand is high for it. So for example, a new iPhone comes out. A new iPhone comes out, the demand is there, there's not a lot of the product, so they can raise the price to an exorbitant amount of money and people are going to pay it. Okay, but then there's other different types of economic theory that are out there. So, the neoclassical economic theory focuses on the determination of the price and the production of the goods and services through the interaction of the supply and demand. This example assumes that the cost of catching each fish is always the same. However, there may be economies of scale in which the cost per unit of a good or service declines as the production increases. And so this is what happens if you flood the market with something, then guess what? Most likely the price of that is going to decrease. So if you flood the market with shrimp, then shrimp as a value is going to decrease. Whereas in that neoclassical economic theory, it's the fact that everything's always worth the same amount. Big problems with that. So this is just a graph that shows you the supply and demand ideals. Economic value. So this is the price that we're willing to pay, and this is where we come into nature, that cost-benefit analysis. What are we willing to pay to protect nature? It's not a fixed amount, and what you're willing to pay and what you actually pay are two different things, and they talk about this in that in the cost-benefit analysis piece, is that, a lot of times we're surveyed on how much we're willing to spend to say, let's say, save the bald eagle, and we put a number down, and that number, of course, is different. It could be different to me, or it could be different to somebody in the military. It could be different to a lot of different people, because that symbolism might mean something different to them. But then when it actually comes time to paying for it, a lot of times we're not willing to pay what we said. And so that's a big deal. The other thing is that the economic value it has a discount rate. And what do we mean by that? Is that it's actually worth more to use now than it is into the future. And this is a big deal with the environment, because guess what? It's better to chop down trees now than it is to save them for the future. And this is why people destroy the environment, because economy-wise or economically wise, all of the true economists say, well, it's better to use it now than we'll worry about the consequences later. But as environmentalists, we tend to think about the future instead of using it now. So, of course, there are always market complications in all of this, and one of the main points here I want to talk about is this externalization of costs. Externalizations of costs is something that's talked about in that Story of Stuff video, and this is that the true price of the product is not captured in the price tag. So the fact is that they give a wonderful example in that video of a radio that's $4.99, but yet it's made like 4 trips around the world. Someone had to produce it, someone had to put parts together, someone had to mine a precious metal for it to go into the radio, but then somehow it ends up on our shelves for $4.99. And they say, well, wait a minute, so the true cost, that radio really should be $100, but the fact is that everyone along the chain pays for the product, sometimes with their life, sometimes with their health, sometimes just living in squalor, and they all pay those sorts of prices along the line so we can get something for cheap. Okay, and so that the Story of Stuff does a wonderful job of explaining externalization of cost. The other thing is, it's really hard to put a price tag on the environment because there are unknown costs and benefits. How can we put a price tag on the fact that we know that people heal 20% faster when they have exposure to natural sunlight? How do we put a price tag on that? And so sometimes the costs are unknown, and so it's really hard to put these things in there. Or limited resources. How can we treat resources as infinite or interchangeable when that's rarely true? Is that oil should be at a really high cost. It should be higher than non-renewable energy. And the reason for that is because it's a finite resource. It's not something that we can create within a human lifetime. So we're going to talk a little bit about economic valuations next. So cost-benefit analysis article is a really good way to segue into this economic valuation, which is a price tag for nature. So while we do think we can't put a price tag on nature, we actually do. And so one way we do this is through this marginal value, which is the willingness to pay compared to the alternative. So the marginal value of like removing a dam and restoring Hetch Hetchy back to what its original thing could be assessed by asking citizens of San Francisco, how much would you be willing to pay for your water if we can't get it from this reservoir? And people might say, oh my God, well, are you willing to have your water bill be $400 a month, and then they would probably say, oh no, leave the damned river there. So that is what it is. The next one is what we call travel cost valuation, and that's how much people are willing to pay for travel to visit an ecosystem. So some ecosystems, of course, are valued more because people are willing to fly across the world to visit those types of ecosystems. Okay, so travel cost estimates may also include the cost of building and maintaining the roads and infrastructure for those destinations. A hedonic valuation is the difference of real estate price affected by environmental alternatives. So what does that mean? It's determining by the difference in the market price of the real estate that is affected by different environmental alternatives. And for example, the hedonic value of a public park can be estimated by the difference between the price people are willing to pay for property near the park as compared by the price they are willing to have property elsewhere. So if you want to live around Central Park, you're going to pay a higher valuation because you're paying for that park in New York City. So there's a higher hedonic valuation on Central Park. Contingent valuation is the value based on what people will pay. So this is where the hard part is. Estimating what people willingness to pay is called that contingent valuation. And sometimes this can be a little difficult because remember, what people will pay versus what they say they will pay are two different things. And so I think, you know, what people say they might want to pay to live near Fairmount Park might be different than what they would pay. And it's what they will pay. So there's a big difference in those valuations. So these are different ways that we place a price tag on nature. So it's really hard to do. I'm not saying that there's not any complications or controversies with these valuations, but it is one of the ways that we do that. And so here's a good example. You might be willing to pay a premium for a home that is located in a natural setting such as near a lake or park, but if you knew that there was a sewage treatment was located nearby, would that influence the willingness that you would pay for this specific location? And so that's just lots of questions that we have with valuation. And you know, the Earth's resources that are not necessary to produce the ecosystem services on which we depend. The natural capital concept is the basis for ecological valuation of ecosystem services. Rather than focusing on the willingness to pay, economists actually determine the ecological value by the potential cost of the loss and degradation of the ecosystem service. So for example, if you own a shore house, then you actually pay flood insurance rates, which is the fact of what it would be if that area got destroyed by a flood, because there's a higher value that it's going to get destroyed by a flood. So that plays a huge role in this, and that's what we call natural capital. So the idea is that economists determine the ecological value by the potential cost or the loss or degradation of that area. So if the Jersey Shore is lost, what would that be? And then a lot of people pay that in taxes or they pay that in insurance costs. So here's a really good map that shows you the cost of a hectare, which is a different type of form of acre that we use to measure of land based on humans if services were lost. So ecosystem services in forest regions and along rivers in tropical and temperate regions are especially valuable compared with those in large expanse of deserts, such as in northern Africa and in central Australia. So you can see here's northern Africa, here's central Australia. Look at this. This is, you know, you're talking in like Siberia, and then look up here, you're talking in Greenland. So you have all of these areas that are not worth a lot of money, and that's because they're not near ecosystem services such as forests or rivers, or they're too cold for people to live in, or too dry. And so this is the question, is also there's a huge fight going on this right now in terms of what is this worth? If all the ice caps melt, what are these areas worth? Okay, so I'm going to stop here and I'll start part 3 for the rest of our chapter 2.